Well, hi, everyone. I hope you've managed to get some food and you can join us for this event. My name is Jeff Colgan. I'm the director of the Climate Solutions Lab. I'm here with my colleague, Mark Blythe, director of the Road Center, and this joint event to highlight the great work by our guest of honor today, Thea Riofrancos. She is associate professor of political science at Providence College. And she has a fairly glittering CV that includes academic stops at Reed College, University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and probably a dozen other places that I've forgotten. So at any rate, she is a prolific author, and some of the students from my own class of politics of climate change might remember a book that she co-authored called A Planet to Win on the Green New Deal. She had a previous book on resource radicals in 2020. And then she has a brand new book that she's going to talk to us about today called Extraction. And so please join me in welcoming Thea Riofrancos.
Thanks so much. So I think there are two rules of this. One is I have to stay near here because it's being recorded, which is hard for me because I rove a lot, but I'm going to glue myself. There's an ambient mic too. Okay, I can rove a little bit. And I'm supposed to stick to around 35 minutes, and I will do my best to do so. 40. Oh, look at this. Loosey-goosey. Okay. You seem very serious in the email. 40 is great. I can definitely do 40.
I can sing so.
Okay. Love it. So this is a presentation on my recently published book. It came out in late September by this exact title, Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism. And maybe just a quick word before diving into the content. This book is published as a non-academic book. It's a more trade kind of public-facing book. This talk will bring it into a more academic level discourse, but hopefully still relatable and approachable for if there's any undergraduates in the room or new grad students, but hopefully also interesting for more expert folks in the room as well. So I'm going to dive right in and start with kind of the central dilemmas and questions at the heart of the book. And then we'll kind of proceed at a 20,000 foot view going to some of the different places that the book takes us to. So the core topic of this book is resource extraction and specifically mining linked to the energy transition. And I look at a specific slice of that, but it is a broader kind of portfolio of minerals and a broader set of supply chains that I also analyze a bit, though I end up focusing specifically on lithium, as we'll see in a moment. But here, what we're looking at is one of like many infographics that you can find on the internet from like Visual Capitalist or commodity analytics firms that kind of show you visually the scale of mining that is quote unquote necessary in order to have an energy transition. I put necessary in scare quotes, not because I'm going to say no mining is needed, but just because how much mining is needed is actually a social and political and technical question, not something set in stone. And the way that they went about this infographic is showing us the kind of millions of new tons of a specific set of minerals that will be needed for electric vehicle batteries. So this is not the body of the car. It's not the steel. It's not the aluminum. It's not the electric motor. This is specifically the battery, and it's drama. It's a subset of the minerals in that battery. So this is just looking at a few specific minerals: lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, et cetera. And then looking at between now, or this was from 2022, but between 2022 and 2035, how many more mines do we need? And it's a lot, but again, this is a subset. We're not looking at what we need for wind turbines or transmission lines or solar panels or, again, even the rest of the vehicle. There's also another interesting thing to note about this infographic, which is that each of these little, I think it's 384, as it says, mines that's being depicted is a cute little thing of Microsoft Word clip art from the 1990s. Like, here's a little mine. This is what a mine looks like. That's not what a mine looks like. And so I want to kind of take us a little bit more into empirical and material reality in terms of what mining looks like in the landscapes that it occurs. And so one or two of these little represented mines refers to these mines in the Atacama Desert or similar lithium mines that could be built to suit increased increasing demand for lithium. This is the Atacama Salt Flat, which is one of many dozens of salt flats in the Atacama Desert, which is in the northern reaches of Chile and was a place that I did field work. The salt flat, just this one salt flat that these mines are on, is 2/3 of the size of the state of Rhode Island. So it's a very large salt flat, the third largest salt flat in the world and the largest in Chile. And on it sit two very large scale lithium mines that pump out lithium rich brine from underneath the salt crust and evaporate it in these large evaporation ponds. A kind of weird way to extract, and not like the hard rock mining that we're often used to, though lithium also comes in hard rock and clay and other forms as well. And so as the sun does its work evaporating, the lithium liquid in these evaporation ponds gets more concentrated. So the sun is kind of doing this free labor, and then the rest goes through chemical refining and then enters into those supply chains for electric vehicle batteries. But lest we think an extractive frontier is just a mine, it never is. There's also other stuff going on there, whether human communities, non-human nature, usually all of those things. And so just about 20 miles away on that same salt flat, but instead of in the mining part of the salt flat, we're in a nature preserve that is protected by the Chilean government. You can see beautiful Andean flamingos and other endemic species hanging out on the salt flat itself, right above where the lithium is, but again, a little bit away from the actual mining installations. And you can see this seemingly kind of otherworldly, beautiful landscape that is one of Chile's top 2 tourist destinations because it's so stunning. So this is where the lithium mining takes place, in this same landscape. And just to add a little bit, the landscape is not just mining and it's not just non-human nature. It is also a set of indigenous communities, 18 of which specifically live around the perimeter of the salt flat. And mining of lithium at this massive scale for decades now has already been scientifically shown to reduce the biodiversity that we're seeing there and to make water more difficult to access for these small and medium scale farming plots that we're seeing there. Despite the amazing kind of ancestral forms of irrigation that allow for agriculture in the driest desert on Earth and the second driest place on Earth, lithium mining is throwing this already wet water negative system, because it's a desert, so it's water negative, further out of balance, right? And so this is kind of one view into the kind of global commodity market look, but then the kind of more grounded reality of what mining looks like along extractive frontiers. And all of this demand for lithium and then the impacts that it's already creating in existing lithium producers kind of raises the question of, why is lithium so important? Lithium is, as many people in this room probably already know at this point, when I started this project, people used to say, oh, are you studying the psychiatric drug lithium and its supply chains? And lithium's an input into all sorts of industrial end uses. But today, the prevailing destination of lithium that is mined, wherever it is mined, whether it's Chile, Australia, Argentina, China, is electric vehicle batteries. And specifically, as we'll see in a moment, individual car batteries. And so the kind of energy transition, which takes as its core task decarbonizing our economy and our society, in theory, right? We can discuss how much this is actually happening, but regardless, the goal is to decarbonize entire economic sectors. And lithium batteries play a role in 2 aspects of decarbonization that are very important. One is that they allow for electric mobility, which helps us get the carbon out of the transportation sector. The transportation sector is the US's #1 carbon polluting sector. It has the largest carbon footprint of any of our sectors. And then number 2, lithium batteries in a larger format, really big lithium batteries, are used increasingly to stabilize energy from intermittent energy sources from solar and wind on electricity grids. So this is also the stationary use compared to the mobile use is also a growing end use of lithium. For all those reasons, the transportation sector, the energy sector, 2 most carbon intensive sectors in the US, in the other order, 2 most carbon intensive in the world, energy is top and transportation sector second globally. We can see why lithium would be in such hot demand in a world undergoing unevenly, perhaps, some kind of energy transition. And so these same forecasting agencies that tell us how many exact mines might need to be built also look globally at these demand curves. Lithium in particular needs to grow a lot. That's mainly because lithium actually historically has been a pretty small market. So scaling it is a huge task to get it able to become an input for a multi-trillion-dollar global auto industry from like previously a more marginal commodity market. And as I said previously, that blue part of the bar on the right side is how much of this demand comes from individual passenger vehicles and how that will increase over time. So now maybe it's 60-something%. In a few years, it might be 80-something% of lithium is destined for individual electric vehicles. And so the kind of rising demand raises an obvious question is like, is there enough supply? And the short answer is yes, but that doesn't tell you very much in the world of extraction because the map of production is not the map of underlying geological occurrence. Underneath the ground, there's lots of lithium. And in fact, it's quite abundant in terms of the world's minerals. But it's been historically and to this day presently extracted from a few major countries. I listed them already of Australia, Chile, China, Argentina. There's a few new countries added to that mix, Brazil, Canada, Zimbabwe, et cetera. But mostly it's a quite concentrated market still. And so that concentration of production combined with high levels of demand means that there are recurrent imbalances of supply and demand. And the imbalance goes in both directions. There are moments where there hasn't been, quote unquote, enough lithium on the market. And there have been other moments where there's a glut because a really high price point maybe produced a lot of investor interest and then you get overproduction and a saturated market. And that story is exactly what's unfolded over the past few years. So when I was first working on this book, lithium was just line go up like forever and ever. It's like lithium is just going to become the most expensive commodity on earth, apparently. And then it crashed midway through me writing this book, which actually forced me to reanalyze a bit and think through more precisely about commodity cycles, about the highs and lows of commodity markets, about what causes the booms and busts. And lithium has been named by a few different agencies that track these things as one of the most volatile minerals over the past decade. And we could think that some of that volatility is not just like the mismatch between geology and market demand, but is also how geopolitically salient lithium has become, which introduces a lot of political volatility as well into the production of this mineral and the chemicals that result from it. So this is exactly the type of thing that the US government and other governments around the world mean when they say that lithium is a, quote, critical mineral. A critical mineral is something that there's a lot of demand for, coming from a mix of like the economic needs, but also because governments see lithium and other of these critical minerals as necessary for national security. It's not just about the economic demand. It's also the fact that governments want to ensure that there's enough because they view lithium batteries and these supply chains as relevant to their geopolitical stature. So a critical mineral, as it says here, essential for economic and or security purposes. And either there's supply scarcity, underlying supply scarcity, geological, or as in the case of lithium, there's more of an imbalance and there's vulnerability to disruption and moments of market shortages. And so all of this combines to put lithium on the critical mineral list. And interestingly, it was Trump's first government that designated lithium as such. We'll come back to Trump a couple of times, for better or worse. But, you know, one of the arguments of my book and my general approach and of this talk is that critical minerals are not just like a technical label. They are, but they also are politically and economically productive. Once you label a mineral as critical, you basically say this is important for national security. So maybe the state needs to step in and support the sector, or maybe the state needs to securitize the sector. That also signals to markets and to investors that this could be a reliable sector to invest in potentially. And it also means that lithium is going to be a site of conflict because whenever something, a natural resource, becomes more politically and economically salient, forms of conflict produce that and then result from it. That conflict could be geopolitical. It's also between communities and corporations, as well as a whole host of other terrains of conflict. So labeling something as a critical mineral, I argue, kind of gives us really interesting insight into the political economy of the energy transition, where all of these competing forces of states, markets, investors, corporations, policymakers, social movements, labor unions, et cetera, are like working in collaboration and competition to shape the very materiality of the energy transition itself. And as just kind of indicated, when I think about what the political economy of the energy transition means, I focus in my own work on these three sets of actors. This is not an exhaustive list. You could think about the role of scientists. You could think about the role of labor unions. So this is not me saying these are the only actors that matter, but they are the most relevant actors to the political economy of lithium, at least in my own research and estimation. And maybe the one thing that I want to draw our attention to briefly before moving on into the kind of thick of the empirical work is that I have social movements up here as a political economy actor. They are not always considered as such. Oftentimes in normative approaches to political economy, whether in economics, political science, sociology, the main actors are states and firms. And like even the word political economy makes us think that, like, there's politics and there's economics, and the elite actors that govern both of those are who matters to us. But I think it'll become clear why social movements are relevant to even like our grand macroeconomic understandings of what these supply chains look like. And one reason for that I'll get to at the end of the talk is that disruptive social movements can affect the possibility of supply as well as complicate government policies around critical minerals. Won't dwell here, but for the record, I did research. I went to different places in the world. I will say one thing, which is that this book was my first time leaving Latin America to do research. And that happened through a series of serendipitous events that brought me to Europe for other reasons, through which I discovered that European policymakers, even before the pandemic, were becoming obsessed with this idea of supply chain security, or insecurity as it was. And then the pandemic further kind of deepened that policy way of thinking. And that was also unfolding in the US at the same time. So I decided to kind of explore the idea of extractive frontiers and the state policies around them outside of Latin America, which had been traditionally where I did my research. But the project did start in Chile, and that's where I conducted the most field work. So to start out in this kind of political economy of the energy transition and taking lithium as a case study, I'm going to start with governments. That is partly because I'm a political scientist, maybe, in theory, or that's how I was trained. And so I'm supposed to think that governments and public policymakers are important. But maybe like slightly more to the point, I would argue that extractive sectors are sectors that get a lot more state attention than other sectors that compared to finance, manufacturing, services, entertainment, whatever, agriculture. Not to say that there aren't public policies for each of those, but in resource extraction, you often have to like move through the state in order to get a project off the ground. In a lot of global South contexts, you have to contract directly with the state because the state is the technical owner of all subsoil resources. That comes out of histories of resource nationalism. In other countries, even if that's not the case, like in the US, that's not the case, you still have to get lots of permits, lots of licenses. And in addition, supportive policies are very important to kind of getting mining off the ground. So we're going to start with governments, and we're going to start in the global north, which is not how this project started. As I said, I started in Chile, but I want to start us here kind of closer to home because I think some of this discourse will be familiar. What's interesting is that these are all from 2019 to 2021. They're kind of from the first few years of my field work when I started collecting a lot of media data and media kind of coverage on how these topics were being framed. And every so often I'm like, I should update this slide because surely like the headlines are different, and they're not. And like what's interesting is like these headlines happen even in moments of like market gluts. Even when there's tons of lithium on the market, everyone frames it as scarce. This was a moment where there was more market scarcity, but the discourses are very durable, and partly because they have an older history to them as well. And so that's kind of where I want to get into, like, under what circumstances did European and American policymakers start to freak out about their ability to get critical minerals? And we should question this in part because it leads to a huge policy shift called onshoring, which is a dramatic change. So we need to ask, like, why were European and American policymakers starting really in the kind of late 2000s to very much to the present, increasingly worried about their ability to access raw materials? And so this is a kind of potted history. Maybe that's not the right way to put it. It's a very schematic history. There's obviously more detail in the book, but I want to give us the main points because I want us to see two things. One is like, how did we get to this moment of onshoring and supply chain security that we're in right now? And second, like, how do resources get contested at the global scale? So, understanding why global North governments start to get anxious about their access to resources, you could date that. You could do hundreds of years history of anything. You can always go back ad infinitum, but I really date this and periodize it to the 1970s. There are a lot of analogies floating around that compare the 1970s to our current moment, right? And I think sometimes those are a bit fast and easy, or the analogy doesn't quite fit. But there is something about a moment in the 70s where raw materials and energy resources were so contested, and there were major battles between the global North and global South, and a moment, and the energy crisis and oil crisis that resulted from that. And then today, a moment of poly crisis and new forms of South-North contestation. So that's some of the intuition of what's bringing us there. But a little bit more specifically, The 1970s were what I'll call the apotheosis, like the height of third world, then called third world, resource nationalism. This was a moment of tons of resource nationalizations, of new state-owned firms, of OPEC, which was founded in the early 60s, but really takes on full life by the 70s. And in direct relation and maybe counter-reactionary relation to that is a set of developments that unfold in the global north. So for the older folks in the room, they may remember this firsthand, like the idea that there were long lines to get gasoline or that there was like a crisis over access to oil. And the way that the global north responded to that was twofold. One is maybe familiar to us, which is they did military coups and soft power and things around the world to make governments more pliable. So that's part of the story. But they also set up resource frontiers within the global north. They said we cannot rely on these volatile third world states, which used to be our colonies and are getting totally out of hand in their behavior. Instead, we should have some oil from the offshore of the UK, the North Sea of the UK. We should open up Alaska more. We should open up the oil around the Gulf of Mexico more. And so you get a lot of internal resource frontiers and a kind of onshoring or reshoring of energy resources. Fast forward a bit to 2008, and this is another moment where Western legitimacy and Western economic power is kind of taking a hit. So that's the other thing we're kind of tracking here. In 2008, obviously the financial crisis during which I think all of us were alive does lots of things to global politics and global political economy. But here I want to zoom in on how it delegitimizes neoliberalism and the kind of offhand approach to economic policy and to supply chains and the encouragement of offshoring and outsourcing and these globally dispersed supply chains. That's one thing it does. But secondarily, and some folks in the room may not be as aware of this, but at the same time that we had a financial crisis in the US, there was actually an economic boom in a lot of the rest of the world because there was a major commodity boom. And 2008 was kind of the height of that commodity boom or near the height of it. And what that owed to was China's rapid industrialization, a topic we're very familiar with now, but was kind of new to Western policymakers in that era. Their industrial processes drove up demand and prices for raw materials across the board, copper, beef, oil, soy, you name it. And this indicated two things to the West. One is, oh no, we have a real economic competitor in a way that the Soviet Union never was. And number two, we can't get these raw materials as cheaply as we used to because Chinese development is driving up the cost. This is exactly when both the EU and US policymakers in these random back offices of bureaucratic agencies that no one cares about started writing things like, we need supply chain security. We need critical minerals at home. We need to do what we did in the 70s, but for critical minerals. But no one really listened yet. You know, they were ideas lying around, to quote Milton Friedman, but then they got their political opening in a variety of ways, right? The kind of resurgence and emergence of new forms of right and left-wing populism that were thinking differently about the economy compared to neoliberalism. That really starts under Trump in the US. There are increasing trade wars that Trump and the Chinese government both play a role in. And in that moment, Trump really turns his attention to critical minerals. As I said, he puts lithium on the critical minerals list. He fast tracks some lithium projects that are now under construction, et cetera. You know, despite the fact that he doesn't like EVs, he loves lithium, which is something we can talk about if we want. And then this really picks up steam as the pandemic happens, Russia invades Ukraine. There's a lot of geopolitical instability. Increasingly, even the great powers don't trust their ability to acquire raw materials through free trade or through these sprawling supply chains. They want to bring extraction and manufacturing home. And they also want to do this, of course, to compete with China, because China had a very whole and remains having a very whole of supply chain perspective to its industrial policy. And so Biden intensifies this trade war with China. He makes it much more targeted. So we could say it's perhaps more intelligent, but it's no less antagonistic towards China. He really codifies supply chain security, both through executive orders, through the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera, encouraging more domestic mining. Similar stuff happens in the EU with less fiscal firepower, but still, importantly, we have new mining projects being incentivized in the EU. And so I've given you a kind of history of these moments of contention over resources and moments that the West felt less secure in its access to resources. There's a more proximate argument that I won't overly dwell on because it's written up in an article that anyone can read. It's actually open access, so that makes it easier for folks to get at. But I call this the security sustainability nexus in the article. And what I argue there is, with this broader history in mind, but a bit more proximate to like the years that led up to it, why is it that the European Union and the US want to have all of this mining at home? It doesn't make immediate sense. Mining is toxic. It's politically contentious. Nobody likes to live near it. It's low value added. All of the value and profit is concentrated in the higher end manufacturing and the intellectual property rights that owns the kind of technology in the first place. So why would you want to get into this like dirty, low value add industry? If you think it's essential to national security, you will bear those costs, right? And so both, as I just described, European and American officials began to think that way. They also kind of put what we might call a greenwashing twist, or maybe it's not just greenwashing. I don't like to totally dismiss it because I think it's an interesting phenomena. But regardless, there's a lot of rhetorical and to some level policy emphasis saying we also should mine in the West because it's better. It's more responsible, it's more ethical, it's friendlier, it's nicer. It's not what those dirty people do in dirty countries that creates lots of problems, right? And we're not going to address the fact that it's our corporations doing that. But regardless, like, at home, we're going to do it better, right? And so even in the Trump government, shockingly, people made these claims that it wasn't just about security, it was also more ethical. And so, I have an argument that that basically policymakers in some coordination with the relevant firms on the supply chain, automakers, battery makers, and mining companies, coordinated to start onshoring these supply chains. And I argue that it, of course, aligns with the national security interests of these states or how they've constructed those interests. I don't want to naturalize them, but how they perceived the national security dilemma. It also aligns with firms. Why? Because the way that this unfolded was that the US government, and to a lesser degree, the European government, gave companies free money. And no firm is mad about free money, even if it might involve a little more state intervention, a little more kind of limelight or like spotlight on your industry, things that firms don't love. They're like, sure, tax breaks, tax credits, subsidies. Under the Biden government, 75% of the capital cost of a big lithium mine being built right now was offset by a DOE loan. So these are major government outlays that are really, really copacetic for the mining industry, which often struggles to gain enough financial investment. For reasons that we can get into. But it also is good for the downstream firms because they're like more lithium everywhere and maybe more lithium closer to our factories. So there was a kind of supply chain wide benefit of these policies. I won't dwell on this too much. Mark has hosted like multiple speakers that have broken down the Inflation Reduction Act and look at European policies as well. I think there's probably a lot of familiarity in the room. But just to have a sense of their breadth, we have policies that have content requirements or content incentives, both on the EU and American side, like put more of our domestic or regional minerals in your supply chains, either as a mandate or as some kind of stepwise incentive. So this is the European Critical Raw Materials Act, some recycling targets that came from a separate piece of legislation, and then the Inflation Reduction Act. And then we're going to do the classic, developmentalist move or industrial policy move. We're going to incentivize local content. We're going to put barriers to trade so that we don't get as much imported content. So that happened in both the EU and US. In the US, it's been more dramatic, but the EU has also been using its tariff toolkit as well. And then we're going to throw tons of money at these firms. And this is intentionally basically hard to read because like every bullet point was just like a massive amount of money that was given to firms for research and development to offset the capital costs of mining construction. Really recently, in a fascinating move, Trump directly buying equity shares in 3 different mining companies. Well, not Trump himself. It's, he is a personalistic ruler, but not to that level in this case. But the DOE and the Pentagon are now shareholders in 3 mining companies. And when you have a government purchase equity stakes, the main thing it does is raise the kind of value of those shares because it's clear that the government thinks this is an important sector. It's a real signal to private finance to crowd in and to allow for more both loans and direct equity investments from the private sector. And that's exactly what's already happening in these 3 cases of a rare earths mine, a lithium mine, and a potential copper mine. And so Trump has really continued with this industrial policy, not for environmental reasons per se, or not for the goal of the energy transition, but yes, for the goal of what he calls minerals dominance. And so this is bipartisan and it's transatlantic. I would call that a very thick level of consensus, and I refer to it elsewhere as a critical minerals consensus. And so the result of this is quite material, right? It's not just rhetoric. It's not just money flowing around. It's actually starting to shift the map of extraction. And we can just look at a couple of maps here. And just for folks that are newer to thinking about mining, we could get confused and think like 100 mines are going to be built. These are individual mining claims that are often glommed together to create a bigger mine. Mining is super speculative, especially at the early stages. So some of these won't get financed at all. But if even a fraction of these 100 projects in just the Western US states alone gets built, that changes the landscape of the Western US. To have 10 or 15 mega lithium mines alongside copper, rare earths, and other antimony, other things that are being mined and encouraged under the banner of critical minerals, it's a big shift. So that's the US on the left. On the right, it's slightly dated, but there's not a more contemporary map. Unfortunately, I'm sure the EU will come out with one soon. But these are a bunch of mines that are being planned, but also being actively contested in Europe. And I should note, because do we have Serbia there? Yes, we do. And that one has since kind of been potentially reopened as a project, but it has an X there because there was such a massive social movement against it. So Europe too, which is even as a continent more dependent on mining imports than the US is saying we're going to become, a regional mining powerhouse. There were even claims, which seems so absurd now, that by X year, I forget, it was like 2035, something like that. An EU official told me we're going to be self-sufficient in lithium. It's like, okay, good luck, dude. And so, but a lot of mines are being built. That doesn't lead to self-sufficiency. It does lead to more mining in the West and more contention over that. And so that kind of repeats what I just said. It's worth noting, as always, that not only financial turbulence, but also geopolitical turbulence can make the fate of specific mining projects unclear. But, that's precisely why all this government support is so important. And the maybe last thing that I want to say on in this kind of part of the talk is that this does not mean there's less mining in the global south. It just means there's more mining overall and that the map of mining is mutating. Okay, I want to go to green capitalism. I've already introduced this to some degree because I've talked about firms, and some of this will build on what I've already said. In this case, when I say green capitalism, which is sometimes a controversial concept for reasons that I understand and I'm happy to get into, like, is there such a thing as green capitalism? Should we use this term? Is it all greenwashing or does it even exist? All fair debates and fair questions. I use it pretty empirically just to refer to supply chains or sectors or economic activities that are claimed to have some link to the energy transition, to adaptation, to mitigation of the climate crisis. And so here our green capitalists are lithium firms, battery firms, EV manufacturers, and their investors. And as you'll see in a moment, there's actually a lot of cross-cutting investment across these different domains. And so that brings me to one very interesting development that I want to highlight first in terms of how these green sectors are like shifting capitalist dynamics in relationship also to the geopolitical turbulence. And one of the interesting novel developments we have, it's not historically novel because Fordism did exist, but it's in a recent history novel, which is that firms at the end of the supply chain, battery, EV, are investing in the beginning of the supply chain, because just like governments, they don't trust free trade either, because the world is just too crazy and too polycrisis and whatever for anyone to think that they're going to get lithium on the day that they want it. Plus, there's major competition between great powers over these supply chains. So China any day could say, no more lithium from us, just like it did with rare earths. So you have to lock down your own supply, which has caused this kind of return or this idea of neo-Fordism, where we're reintegrating supply chains that were previously disintegrated or dispersed. And there's a great graphic from my favorite newspaper, the Financial Times. And I just want to note, this is from a year or two ago. So there are many more such deals now. This is only one of 6 pages. So there's a ton more. But these are all examples of upstream investments in raw material assets by downstream firms. And one of the big ones in the US was General Motors directly investing as a shareholder and as a preferred purchaser in the Thacker Pass mine, the same mine that got 75% of its construction costs covered by the DOE, and the same mine that Trump is now an investor in. And so this one mine, you can track the entire bipartisan consensus around critical minerals, and you can track this interesting issue of vertical reintegration of supply chains. The second two I'm going to spend less time on because I want to get to the last third of my talk, which is about to happen. But I just want to note that there are other interesting developments in the worlds of the financialization and commodification of lithium, its emergence on different commodity trading floors, how that's changing the lithium market, and then these more corporate approaches to sustainability, like private certification schemes, things like that. So the book gets into that a lot. I'm happy to answer any questions about it. But to kind of close out our green capitalism section, I want to note some contradictions because I think I've presented so far a very happy version of elite consensus. Like Democrats and Republicans agree, corporations and financiers agree, like Europe and the US agree, everyone agrees, except that there are lots of issues that people in this room are probably somewhat aware of, but I want to name a few of them. I'll focus on the first one because that aligns with the vertical reintegration and the supply chain security stuff, which is, as I said, firms love free money, but they would prefer that money to have no strings attached to it. And there have been strings attached to it. Like if you're going to get this loan, you have to do the investment in the US, or you have to hire US people, or you can't have Chinese people in your supply chain or Chinese firms in your supply chain. So the geopolitics motivates the free money, but it also motivates certain constraints and guardrails and limitations around how the money is used. Firms do not like that because they prefer their complex, sprawling, opaque supply chains that they can manage on their own, and they don't want governments to securitize and nationalize and domesticate their supply chains. That just causes transaction costs at the very least, but can also cause further problems. Like some of these firms, China is a major customer. So if you align your whole economic business model with the US, that could introduce problems for a huge market. And so this brings us to the kind of last portion of the talk where I want to look at what other types of people do in the world, right? We have so far focused on powerful actors, and maybe those powerful actors have tensions with one another and their power is differential. Not everyone has a hegemonic currency like the US. I don't want to flatten all the powerful people, but they share one thing, which is they're relatively elite actors. And so I want to look at states that are less powerful on the world stage, and then also social movements and communities that are for sure less powerful, even within less powerful states. And that kind of brings me to something I mentioned earlier, which is despite all the onshoring, we should not forget or be fooled about where most mining will happen. Over the next decade and probably into the foreseeable future in terms of energy transition, but also computing, semiconductor, AI, military supply chains, all the supply chains that involve lots of mining. Most of that mining will be in Africa, Latin America, and Indonesia. So 2 continents and a country really provide a lot of the world's raw minerals. And that is not changing. That's actually doubling down in this moment of energy transition related mining, which puts Global South states in an interesting position because they have a hot commodity, so to speak. They have critical minerals that are important to the world economy, that are important to great powers, that play a role in this great power conflict. And historically, their leverage and ability to govern those sectors has been weak, but maybe this is an opening, and Global South governments are seizing that. In Indonesia, in Latin America, in Africa. No coincidence that those are the places where a lot of the minerals are coming from. Those are also places where we're seeing a renewal of resource nationalism. So I said, the 70s are back, both in the global north and in the global south, and in direct dialectical relationship with one another, right? And so that's a maybe deeper historical argument that I'm making. But just in terms of the present, we have all of these new ideas around resource nationalism. It's not the classical form where the state takes your property, but it's more the form of you have to do a joint venture with us, or we apply some local content requirements to make sure this funnels into domestic industry, or we ban exports or put export quotas on exports. So you can't just head out with the raw materials. You have to enter them into domestic supply chains. Indonesia really, I don't want to say pioneered it because it's an older developmental strategy, but for the modern era of these supply chains, Indonesia is a pioneer, and a bunch of African and Latin American states are kind of following in Indonesia's footsteps. There's even ideas of OPEC too, right? So there's the lithium OPEC, which had a moment when there were a bunch of left-wing governments at the same time in Latin America, and they were starting to coordinate. We'll see if that comes back. Literally a few days ago, the DRC says we should have a strategic minerals OPEC. So they're proposing it. At the upcoming COP30, there's going to be a lot of discussion of how can we use multilateralism to coordinate these supply chains to the benefit of the world's majority versus, the more elite consumers of some of these things. So this is what's happening in the global south. But, again, just like with the elite consensus not being easy, the elite policy consensus in the global south is also not easy. There are a lot of obstacles, dilemmas, impediments that prevent or make difficult global south countries from fully making good on both the resource nationalist strategy and the green industrial policy that it's supposed to kind of be linked to. There are some success cases, so I'm not trying to paint an overly bleak story, but there's a lot of ways to stumble. And I list, again, somewhat schematically, 4 arenas in which I think global south governments have trouble doing this well, even if they're good faith and they've got smart people in the room and they're trying their best. There are some structural impediments that are difficult. One is it's hard to move up the value chain. It's actually easier to do resource nationalism, but maintain a resource dependent economy than it is to kind of climb the ladder of development and get to cathodes and batteries and EVs, right? And there's reasons for that have to do with the difficulty of technological transfer, of getting foreign multinationals to act like good faith partners, but also that you don't have an industrial ecosystem yet. So there's a chicken and egg problem that China has solved through a lot of intense, industrial policy force, but is hard to solve in other countries with less high capacity states. There's geopolitical dilemmas, right? Just like the companies are which government do we ally with? The global south is which government do we ally with? Do we stick with China and get Chinese FDI and maybe other supports from the Chinese government and trade opportunities and credit opportunities? Do we go to the US, still the world's largest consumer market, and maybe where you already have your historic trade relations? Can we do both? Indonesia is experimenting. So in a few years, we'll see whether you can be a kind of non-aligned global south power and get economic development out of it. There's always, as anyone that's studied resources knows, distributive conflicts around resources, who gets what percentage of revenue or economic benefit and how do you distribute that? And then socio-environmental, and this will kind of bring us to the end of the talk. Increasingly, global south governments face restive populations that are not actually willing to just let their landscapes be destroyed and let these mega mines be built and divert water away from agriculture or human consumption in order to feed a really hungry copper mine. And so there's more and more militancy, more and more environmental consciousness, and more coordination, even transnationally, around groups that are opposed to mining. And so global south government might be in good faith, we want development, but their own people or the folks living closest to the mines may not agree with that. And then they have an internal conflict, let alone all of these more kind of large scale geopolitical and, global market type tensions. So social movements, our last set of actors, but not least. And, what we know in general is that mining is getting more contentious. And you can find that out by attending a mining industry conference during which they will tell you mining is more contentious. They will say how costly it is to purchase the social license to operate, which is how much money does it take, how much investment, how much propaganda, how much buying off of local officials, whatever it is, does it take to get a local population to be quiescent at the least and maybe better accepting and interested in the mine. And this has gotten harder and harder. And I know this from studying resource conflict, but I also, as I said, know it because the industry is really attuned to this. And so what we've seen in the lithium frontier, the kind of global frontier where lithium is extracted or going to be mined, is that protest sort of tends to pop up in broad strokes wherever the lithium frontier goes. That does not mean, and I would never claim, that every community resists mining. They don't. In fact, famously, mining is also very divisive, and some community members might support it. They want a job, et cetera, or their little hotel or cafe gets money from the mine workers, right? So there are lots of local economic reasons that people might support mining, but increasingly it's more conflictual, and lithium is a really good example of this. So early in the kind of modern or contemporary lithium market, the main protest was in Latin America because that's where the mining was or where it was slated to be expanded. What happened next is that as onshoring started to work and mining projects were developed in the Iberian Peninsula, in the Southwest US, in Serbia, in the UK, in lots of places in the kind of global north or the semi-peripheries of the global north, then we got protests in those places. And I'll show you some photos in a moment to see what that looks like. But again, just like we still have mining in the global south, we also still have protests, right? So recently there's been some pretty, in some cases, brutal in Argentina, state repression of a lot of local protests over lithium, and Chile, even under a left-wing government, communities have protested lithium. And so what does this look like? These are some photos, and I use them intentionally to kind of show a range, of like, let's say contentious action or like different repertoires of contention, you can do the classic, blockade, the choke point, so that's you're in the territory, the company has all of its sunk cost and installations there. You just stop the minerals from coming out or you stop the machinery from coming in. You can go to the capital if you galvanize a big enough protest movement, as happened in both Serbia and Portugal, and you can really confront the national government head to head over this. You can also do things like protest camps, which are maybe not quite as militant as the top left, but also involve like situating yourself in the potential site of extraction. And so those are from Google. These are from my field work. And I want to show a kind of different view to especially call attention to what mining landscapes look like before mining happens, but when it's a potential possibility. And all the research shows that that's when mining protest gets the most militant. It's actually not in places that have long histories of mining. It's places where a project is new and will fundamentally change the landscape. Like this beautiful farmland, in northern Portugal, which is like a heritage food site in Europe, may simply not exist in that way if this mine is ever built. But their protest has been pretty successful, so it's been stalled for years. Meanwhile, on the right, we're back at Thacker Pass. This mine, despite lots of protests, lots of lawsuits, faced such an elite consensus and, so many forms of governmental support and downstream investment from car companies that it's moving right ahead, despite protests that in other cases might have stalled the mine entirely. And, so this is a larger kind of set of issues I worked on in Jeff's introduction. He kind of mentioned my prior work. So I have a lot to say on this that I won't say now because I want to get to Q&A and get to my actual last slide, which is one more. But I do want to note that there's a lot of interesting, I don't think we should just view resistance as NIMBYism or as just purely negative. Because if you go to these communities and you also see these communities as political actors in their own societies, there's a lot of interesting policy ideas that come out of these places. And I would say we could think of it as a form of environmental governance, non-state perhaps, though sometimes linked with progressive political projects that take state power. But, all of this protest, which both complicates onshoring and complicates resource nationalism. So whether you're in the global north or global south, you're kind of facing maybe similar forms of resistance from local movements. It raises this question of is all this mining necessary to this level? Because apparently wherever we mine, we create environmental impacts. Communities don't always love it. And, maybe to put the bleakest part out there, the mining industry is more associated with the deaths of human rights activists or local activists than any other industry on earth, right? So it's also a very deadly sector, and maybe we don't want to proliferate it unnecessarily. And so I'll just leave with end with this closing thought, which is that I was lucky enough to do some research with a think tank that I work with, the Climate and Community Institute, and we did the same modeling techniques that all of those forecasters that I showed you use, but we put in different assumptions and parameters. And what we found is that not only can you get to zero emissions transportation, which with much less lithium, not than we have today. We need more lithium. So I'm not going to say we don't need any more lithium mines, but we don't need as many as the 400, or whatever it was that I showed you at the beginning there. Because what matters is what type of transportation policy and built environment we build and construct in the process of the energy transition. And everything from battery size to recycling rates to mode, what type of transportation are you taking to battery chemistry even plays a big role in how much mining is necessary. And since mining is feeding into local conflict and geopolitical conflict, we might want to think of a less resource intensive way to get to a zero carbon world. And I will leave it there.
You can field your questions. I will pass the mic.
Right.
Because it's being recorded, so you need the mic.
Okay.
Who wants to go? You happen to be close.
Hi, thank you so much. Is this picking up? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm wondering is, I want to focus on the last part where you talk about the social movements and, indigenous movements and all, and them coming together. And what I'm wondering is, in your field work across the sites, is there any relationship you found between, the formal identity and of indigeneity and how much of their regular daily sustaining survival depends on, a kind of a non-external market kind of interactions, i.e. participating in work or buying things elsewhere. And Also, what are the other industries that come up that sustain this? Oh yeah, this seems like a good option. We need jobs anyways. That's what we're doing anyways. We need jobs, right? So what are the other industries that kind of work in tandem with mining as well in the local landscapes that are kind of like a plan for building mines? I hope. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Should I do one at a time?
Yeah, go.
Okay. So, great question. Maybe I'll zoom out one level and I'll try to get to the factors you asked about, which are like economic livelihood, the sort of economic ecosystem, but also you mentioned like the identity and how well, whether it's recognized as such of the communities in question and whether they're indigenous or not. But maybe just to zoom out a little bit, like, what causes mining conflict versus like causes communities to adopt and accept mining, right? Because those are obviously like the two outcomes. If a mining project shows up, you could have, I guess, like neutrality, but usually it's either like communities are like, oh, this could be an interesting economic prospect, or they're like really against it, or kind of both at once, depending. And what we see is that it's not the like sheer environmental effects on their own, but it's like the combination of environmental impacts and some really negative experience in the policy process. And so, for example, and this will get to the livelihood question a little bit indirectly, we might expect that everywhere that there's water scarcity and a really water hungry mine is being built, we're going to get protests because like humans need water. That's like a really clear impact. And instead, that's not the case. We have lots of mines in arid areas that didn't necessarily face large scale insurrections against them. It's when twofold. And so this is going to get to also the indigeneity question. When people have a relationship to the water, to the land, and maybe to the livelihoods that it supports. So that can be agriculture, but it can also be cultural relationships of thinking that certain water systems or their broader, ecosystems are sacred, are culturally important. So it's kind of the sheer resource pressure of the mine, meanings associated with those resources that might make people mad about the mine's resource use or impact. And then there's a third piece or third or fourth piece. So I want to get at, do people have like an alternate livelihood? That can be empowering to them, right? If there's some other alternative other than the mine that they want to work in or already do work in. In fact, sometimes we get mining contestation from more elite actors, like in an industry, like, oh, here our beautiful wine industry in Argentina will be ruined by these mines, or our ecotourism industry will be ruined. So then you also get allies who are more like local business people that are against the mine, right? But if people don't have any economic options, which is often the case in like rural peripheries, north and south, they might be like, please get us some jobs, even if they're crappy construction jobs and they don't last very long and whatever it is, right? Maybe to get at one other thing with the indigeneity, we do see a relationship there. I really don't want to be essentialist in the most classic sense and say like indigenous people hate mining. There's like a lot of history, not only of there being mining in indigenous lands, but also like the Aztec Empire and Maya Empire. I mean, there were indigenous civilizations that mined, not in the same way as global capitalism does per se, but it's not like the two don't mix at all. But there is a whole kind of new regime of international rights that pertain to indigenous communities and peoples. There's much more consciousness of those rights. And so indigenous communities self-identifying more likely to say, we deserve prior consultation. We deserve prior consent because the ILO says we do, or the UN says that we do. And maybe like a small farming community in Portugal, they might make those claims, but they don't have the full force of international norms behind them, right? That's them being innovative and saying, okay, there's this rights regime for indigenous people. It should be applied to all land dependent peoples, not based on formal kind of ethnic identification, as you said.
Thank you so much, Thea. Fantastic talk. Really, really interesting. I have two quick questions that I think I want to zoom out a little bit and situate your talk in relation to the fossil fuel industry. Mm. So the first is just how should we think about the extractive impacts of lithium in this case, or any other critical mineral or sort of green capitalist input that you want to talk about in relation to the extant impacts of fossil fuel extraction. Mm-hmm. So scale comparison, replacement, non-replacement, et cetera. So any comment you have on that would be interesting. And then the second question is about, again, the movements. So if I'm a fossil fuel executive, I'm thrilled about the dynamics that you're describing, mm-hmm. because you're cleaving the environmental movement between sort of the green transition energy folks and the conservation land protection movements, which then creates a nice opportunity further my own business interests as a existing extractive industry pumping out fossil fuels. So I'm just wondering if you have any sense of whether that dynamic is playing out, whether fossil fuel industries are taking advantage of that, and how we should think about that dynamic.
Yeah, such good questions, both of which I address both in some neurotic detail on the like extractive volumes front in the book, but also some personal anecdotes about this fossil fuel piece that you mentioned. So I'll just start in the reverse order a little bit, but then I'll address the bulk of your first question afterwards. I have had the experience, which has been very confusing to me as an advocate of an energy transition, of being told I'm like doing the fossil fuel industry's work for it, not for the exact and slightly more nuanced reason you just mentioned, which is like divisions among environmentalists, but more just simply that like pointing out any problem with the renewable energy transition is like propaganda for the fossil fuel industry. Which, on the one hand, I have not found any evidence. So I'd be fascinated if it exists, I'm open to seeing it and analyzing it, that fossil fuel interests are like behind the anti-mining protests, where you can find evidence of that in like solar and wind, like NIMBYism, like anti-solar wind NIMBYism. You can find some Koch money behind that. And so, but the fossil fuel industry and its lobbying groups, I don't think it would be that smart for fossil fuels to like emphasize the problems of extraction in general, because that like is a little close to home. Not only that, like, thanks. Not only that, like they're directly investing in all these critical minerals, all of them, and not to the degree that maybe some very technocratic green types hope for, where like the fossil fuel industry was going to almost transition itself just by like hedging its bets and betting on the future. Like instead, it's these smaller investments compared to their overall fossil fuel investments, yet they're important and yet they could grow and they are strategic and they are hedging. And so I don't know how much of a light they want to shine on these issues, because now they are implicated as investors, which I think, one problem with green capitalism as a concept is that it's getting harder to delineate from brown or dirty or fossil fuel capitalism, because there's a lot of cross investment and even shared technologies like geothermal borrows from, the fracking industry and et cetera, which is very interesting to analyze, but complicates our understanding of a kind of neat transition. Okay, questions you didn't ask, but I will come back to your main question, which is in the book, like one of the harder parts, just in terms of my technical capacities and like my normative commitments, was to compare side by side how much extraction is involved in ICE vehicles and in internal combustion, both to like make the vehicle and to supply it with ongoing fuel, versus like how much is used in an EV. And the short answer, it will surprise no one, which is that there's a lot more mining in an EV, but there's a lot more climate crisis in an ICE vehicle. That's one thing, meaning I think of, and this book has not changed my view on this whatsoever, that the climate crisis is like our existential crisis. There's a poly crisis, but I would put it near the top in terms of its implications for everything. And so absolutely, we need to get onto electric mobility, and we get a lot of benefits that way. One is we don't have to extract massive volumes of hydrocarbons just to fuel for combustion that's burnt, and a lot is lost to entropy, and it's a very inefficient way. Like, ICE motors are less efficient than electric motors in that way. So that's great. We get much better in terms of carbon reduction that way. And we, right. So that's like why EVs are obviously better. The issue is that EVs do involve a lot more mining, as I said. But the important thing to remember is that all of that mining can be recycled. We are not doing that, but it is possible. So you could, in a perfect world, and many like very pro-green capitalist types like talk about this in their books, which is we could move to a totally zero carbon transportation system and a perfectly circular one. Because maybe we need one big burst of mining and then we can recover 99% of that lithium, cobalt, nickel, whatever it is from those batteries, which we can do. China does, there's some recycling in Europe. We don't have a lot in the US yet. And so there are major advantages in terms of not having to extract for fuel and circularly using the minerals, where in a perfect world, way less extraction for even an EV in every household, let alone like a better approach to the transportation system. The problem is we don't live in that world in a variety of ways. And I'll just name two quickly. And if there's time, we can maybe get one more question, which is that we are not building out nearly quickly enough the recycling infrastructure we need. So all of these electric vehicles are going to reach their end of their life in 10 or 15 years, and their batteries will go to landfills unless we have recycling capacity. So we're not leveraging circularity really yet. And the other thing is that we live, I've used energy transition throughout this talk, but we aren't in an exact energy transition. And there's this great new book that people may have heard of, More, by a French historian of energy, where he actually shows historically and presently that we're just adding to the energy mix. We're not decreasing fossil fuels. That's a little simplistic. China is, to some degree, is plateauing in terms of electricity emissions. That's happening globally to some extent too. So there are pockets where we see a transition happening, but globally in the energy mix, it's more of everything. So we would actually need to live in some planned ecological perfect society where we're literally not extracting oil. We're moving away from that. We're recycling all of the stuff and we're planning ahead with that recycling facility. Then we could get into a way less resource intensive, but the possibilities there in technical terms, we just have to make it politically possible.
Just to say before we go to Jen, we don't actually finish at 1. We can take
Oh.
the question. That's fine. You don't get
Wow.
off the hook that easily.
Okay, let's keep going.
All right. Well, thank you for that interesting talk. I wanted to pick up more on the motivations of the protesters. So are the protesters always opposed to the mines, or are they bargaining for better conditions? Because we've talked about renewable energy. A lot of people have argued that they're essentially just trying to get some of the benefits from the projects. And you mentioned that the developers now are saying it costs more to site these things. The social costs of operating are higher. And I'm wondering if that's what's going on here. And some of that related literature on renewables has also talked about how FPIC, which is a big thing in Latin America, actually empowers people to bargain, and they bargain through protest in order to get more concessions. So I'm wondering if these protesters are abolitionist, which is kind of how you've described it, or whether they're just savvy bargainers.
Both and. They are increasingly abolitionist, if we want to use that term. I'll say they're increasingly anti-extractivist. They increasingly do not want the mine at all, if we are to believe their statements. Now, we could take a cynical view, which isn't necessarily pejorative, but just seeing people as more savvy, more entrepreneurial, like rational choice actors that are saying one thing for tactical reasons, but actually believe another thing. And that is possible. But I would say there's a couple of phenomena or patterns that are supported in the large end literature, like the kind of large scale quantitative literature on anti-mining protests. So what I research is inherently anecdotal in the sense that I went to particular places and met particular people, and it's biased because I went to people who are actively protesting, right? So we want to remove the selection bias and the anecdotal quality and just say, what does the research that looks at all mining protests in the world say, or all the mining protests in Latin America? And it says a couple of things. One is that opposition to court, where the goal is stopping the mine from ever happening, the professed goal, and from what we can glean from interviews and ethnography, like the actual goal, is on the rise. And it's not only on the rise, and this is an argument I make in my book, Resource Radicals, it's like a novel idea, which you're picking up on. You're getting at its novelty. Why would a community say absolutely no? Why wouldn't they just bargain for better? And there's a whole host of reasons that have to do with Indigenous rights, environmental consciousness, the growing negative reputation of the mining industry. We could go on. But communities have not only gotten more emboldened to protest, they've gotten more emboldened to protest in a way that is purely oppositional. However, there are other communities that seek negotiation, but there's a third thing that you're getting at, which I don't think is intentional, but is absolutely empirically happening, which is communities that start oppositional. If they don't win, then they enter into negotiations. And the research also suggests that their hand is stronger. That may not have been intentional in the way that you're somewhat framing it, but it is like an unintended happy consequence where if you protest really effectively against a mine, you shut down its operations or you shut it down at the permitting stage, the corporation knows that they can't just run over you. They have to offer you something. And then they offer you something, whether it's jobs, whether it's other forms of corporate social responsibility, other forms of local economic development, et cetera. And so we really do see both more opposition, but we see a subset of that tilting into negotiation. In the case studies on Latin American cases in particular, where there's the most overall opposition and the most of these dynamics that I'm naming, there's also interesting back and forth. You oppose a mine, but the mine gets the permit anyway, you negotiate, then this is kind of what I was saying to the gentleman up here, then you get excluded again, and the company's not listening to you anymore because they think they've got you in a good place. Then you're no, we don't like this experience of exclusion. So now we're going to protest again. And you have these back and forth patterns, opposition, negotiation, which is interesting from like a kind of democratic perspective or governance where you have like contentious and then more normal forms, kind of normal forms of politics. But for investors, this is not great. They're like, this is prolonging everything. We have no idea what the outcome is going to be. There's a lot of promises being made to the community. And so sometimes in those back and forth moments where the company's trying to save its project, investors pull out and those mines never happen. So an interesting result of this more oppositional protest, whether it ends with opposition or kind of routes to negotiation, is you have a lot more stranded assets in the world, which is why mining companies are so worried about this phenomena. Because it's not just like pesky, like unruly communities. It's like this might be your financiers pulling out. And in Latin America, again, is the place where we have the most such examples.
Hi. So my question was more so a question of time frames. Given that it takes so long for these mines to even, if we had a mine ready to go to start running, built off the ground, it might take 5 years for a plan that is ready to go now to be in operation 5, 7, some number of years. So given that the green climate crisis, we're looking at dates in like 2035, 2050 are like no go back points. Given that most of these planned mining operations aren't even going to go anywhere, right? They might be entirely highly speculative that there's these really high social costs that mining sites are facing. How much does this even really matter, this new wave of onshoring and mining investment?
So that's a very good question. And it prompts me to say something, or you're kind of saying it for me, that I usually remember to say at the beginning of my talk. But so I'm glad you brought it up, which is that mines take a really long time to go from discovery to development. And that's the kind of arc that we're looking at. Like we have resource discovery, like, oh, it turns out there's copper underneath here. Interesting. Then you have some junior mining companies or some kind of more risk tolerant kind of mining companies, which are what junior mining companies are, that their role is to kind of move that into like early exploration. They kind of attract capital to kind of get that. And then usually they sell to a bigger mining, a more familiar or known mining company. And so that takes a long time. Permitting takes a long time. Protests can delay things. As I said, financial and price volatility can really delay things. It's interesting because the long time scale of mining is a cause and result of price volatility, right? Because there's a way that like, some of the price crashes happened because there was a bunch of interest in mining and then that's brought online into markets and then there isn't the demand to soak it up for whatever reason. Maybe some major countries like the US stalled their energy transitions a bit. So now there's all this lithium floating around that we thought was going to be for the US EV revolution that now has kind of stalled under Trump. And so then you have this overproduction thing. Then the prices crash, investment crashes. But what that means is you cleared the deck for some really entrepreneurial, again, more risk tolerant firms, or maybe Chinese firms. And I'm not, again, trying to essentialize, but their logic of capital and their business model is somewhat distinct, and they will tolerate more risk and tolerate way lower price environments because they don't have to satisfy Wall Street. They have to satisfy Beijing, which has a different logic than Wall Street does, right? And so what I guess I'm saying is there's a mismatch between the fast turnarounds that investors want and the longer time frames of mining, and that itself creates this price volatility. And so that's maybe a little bit of context for your question. But to answer it, just because a mine might take 10 years to build, first of all, that can be sped up, often in ways that aren't awesome, but sometimes in ways that are not terrible. Like usually it's because of regulatory fast tracking, which isn't ideal because actually when you deregulate, then you create litigation later. And this is a pattern that we see in the literature. And this maybe responds a little bit to this question about conflict, where if you run the permitting process through and then, oops, it turns out like a major, cattle ranching firm is like negatively affected by the water use of the copper mine, then they're going to sue the government or sue the copper mine. So it's actually better to just do good regulation to avoid all the litigation and conflict later, in my opinion. But regardless, you can fast track mines and hope to build them more quickly. You can get government support for the mines, right? So there are ways to speed up these timeframes. They're not written in stone. And regardless, the time frame, like let's say it takes 10 years to get a mine into development, then there's like a 30 or 40 year period. And this is kind of where you're getting into with like, is the climate crisis going to even make these investments realistic at all, including that mining in various degrees depends on its local environment, especially for water usage, right? And so like, what are these investors thinking when they're gaming this out 20 years? And especially with the community conflict that's also attending all of this. It's a good question. They might think they will get bailed out. I mean, there's a lot of government interest in these critical minerals, which really like, loosen some of the parameters that some investors or corporations might otherwise be more constrained by. We're in a rush moment. We're in a boom moment still, even though prices are not as high as they were before. The demand line just keeps going up. And it may take 30 years to like recoup all your investments plus a healthy profit, but you can get returns to shareholders much sooner than that in a variety of ways, just by the asset, the value of your asset increasing on the stock market. So we also have this disconnect between what can make something financially profitable versus what actually works as a business model that we see throughout the tech industry, and we could also apply to some degree to extraction.
Thea, thank you so much for just a really inspiring talk and sort of fertile talk, because there's a lot going on here. And as somebody who spent a fair bit of his career looking at oil politics, the comparisons to the 1970s certainly resonate. And some of the things that we saw then and continue to see around oil politics about sort of nonsense talk in various ways seems to be kind of even more so in this. And when I say nonsense talk, I'm specifically thinking about some of the national security arguments and some of the sort of let's have a lithium OPEC argument. I mean, given how bad OPEC actually is at controlling oil prices, good luck to the lithium OPEC folks. I have deep skepticism on it. But I want to come to the sort of the present moment and coming back to some of these questions around that Chris raised and others have raised around the role of lithium in fighting climate change. And so it strikes me that we want two things, right? If we are really deeply invested in environmental goals, we want two things. We want, on the one hand, the lithium industry to do well and to provide as many EV products as we possibly can, as fast as we possibly can. And also, we don't want the mining to be horrendously awful and produce, social and environmental ills to the people who are local to it. And so it seems to me that those two goals, the twin goals, are something that both the industry and the environmentalists could at least potentially sign up to, right? That if we could actually do both of those things, that would be good for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm wondering about is whether there has been an effort anywhere to try to help kind of reduce the cost of the startup phase of a mine. And when I say reduce the cost, what I mean is having almost sort of a recipe or a template for how to do the, lithium mining in a non-evil way, right? In a sort of let's actually address the concerns of locals, but do it in a way that is fast and cheap and certain, so that the needs of capitalists can be met to achieve the goals of the energy transition. And I think if you're sincere in your desire to meet the challenge of climate change, you can't just sort of dismiss this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like really wanting this industry to work is an environmental goal. Mm-hmm. And so I just wonder whether there's been any efforts in that regard to try to actually help companies do this in a way that is less obstructive to local interests.
Yeah, there are good examples, or they're not all good, but they're instructive. There are efforts, I'll put it that way, in the private sector and in the public sector, both like private sector governance and public sector governance, and in different parts of the world. But I'm going to just say one thing about the recipe or toolkit kind of idea, which is there is something a little bit tricky about lithium in particular that doesn't pertain to copper or some of these other minerals, but is the case for lithium, which is that it is a really weird element. It's an alkaline metal. It is naturally very reactive, doesn't exist in metallic form in nature, always exists in compounds, which means in more ordinary language that every lithium deposit is really different from every other lithium deposit in a way that is not the case with most other minerals that we mine. And even like a brine deposit A to brine deposit B, completely different, because it's like, well, what other minerals are in that brine? Is there magnesium, which is an impurity from the lithium perspective? What's the concentration? What's the parts per million of lithium? Because that will result in different amounts of evaporation and different scales of those evaporation ponds. Are we going to try to directly extract the lithium, which is called DLE, where we use chemical or physical membrane filters to get the lithium out of the water without it, and then we can re-inject the brine? And does that have environmental benefit? Then we get into clay. actually the Thacker Pass mine is a clay deposit. We never really mined lithium from clay at scale. This is an interesting experiment that we're about to embark on, but a lot of the deposits in North America, in Europe, or many of them are clay deposits. And that's a totally novel mining technique that therefore not only do we not exactly know how to separate lithium from clay at scale, but we also don't exactly know what that does to the environment until we kind of see it play out. And I could keep going, like geothermal, lithium brine, pegamite, there's lots of different types of lithium deposits in a way that's unusual. So that's just, an interesting fact that doesn't answer your question at all, but does maybe remind us lithium's an extreme case, but how like unique resource deposits are and how hard cookie cutter governance is, because the interaction with this or that watershed, this or that at this or that altitude level and this or that climate in a world of rapidly changing climate as well is kind of hard to, I think, make purely homogenous. That said, maybe on the technical level, we can't do this, but for sure we can say these are good human rights policies. These are good benefit sharing policies. These are good community benefit agreement approaches. These are ways to avoid litigation, again, whether for self-interest or beneficent elites, like whatever the reason is, like presumably they want their project to happen, as you said. And since I wouldn't put protests as the main threat to projects. And you nicely mentioned the other one, which is finance. The main problem with the mining sector, sorry, not the main problem. The main reason that it's slow and hard to get off the ground is that it's hard to finance it. That's the biggest reason. You have to go way down to get to red tape and further down to get to protest when we actually want to understand what slows down mining. Of course, the industry points the finger at red tape and protest, but that's maybe because they don't want to be mean to their capitalist friends who they're trying to get to finance them, right? But I think a more rigorous political economy shows that finance is often the choke point rather than these. That said, it is more contentious. We've talked about it, and a really skilled social movement can shut down a mine. And so what should governments do? What should the private sector do? I guess I'll give you just like a teaser version of two approaches that exist that are not incompatible, but they are different. One is the world of private auditing and private certification. And I devote some space on the book because it's popular not only with the industry, but to some extent with some activists who see it as a kind of lower cost way, as you put it, to kind of get the industry to govern itself with a bit of social pressure and a bit of visibility, but without binding regulations or sanctions or fines or that sort of thing. The most famous on that front is the International Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA. And I get into what I think of their methodology and the scores that they give, and I end up a bit mixed on it, but a better model could be implemented on that front. That's the kind of multi-stakeholder, voluntary corporate governance stuff. And then in Chile, we have, as I mentioned, a left-wing president for the next few months at least. And we might have a communist one next. Probably not. Probably the fascist will win. But we will have an election of fascism versus communism, which, will feel very 1940s.
Chile, how ironic.
Right, or 1970s in Chile, exactly. Well, it wasn't an election, but we'll see how this plays out. In Chile, for now, we have a left-wing government, and they have really put a lot of thought into this. I am rigorous in my analysis. I see some errors or issues but regardless, it's totally true that they have tried to do a much better form of governance. They have, for the first time, implemented a full prior consultation for a forthcoming lithium project or an extension of a lease. That's never happened in Chile before. It might make it less likely that those communities protest in the future because they were consulted. However, during the consultation process, there were protests and lawsuits. So I'm not trying to say nothing works. I'm just trying to say this is messy and not easy. It's better to have the consultation than not, but it may not mean you have zero protests these days. They also set aside a third of their salt flats for no mining. We have 80 salt flats in Chile, whatever it is. There's tons of them. Not all of them have huge amounts of lithium, but all of them have some because it's really the same brine formation. And now a fraction, but an important fraction of them won't be mined at all, which can mollify some environmental activists. And then you focus on the most productive salt flats and you do joint ventures with foreign firms between a state-owned company and a foreign company. So that brings in more social benefit, maybe. So that's what Chile is trying. I would say they're one of the vanguard countries in trying to do socio-environmental governance of this sector, but also resource nationalism.
You haven't had lunch yet? That was a great talk. Thank you very much, Thea.